Welcome to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We are your hosts, Marlena, Sherry, and Matthew. We are therapists and coaches, and we want to share our own stories with you, as well as the wisdom, insights, and tips we've learned along the way. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.
Hi, and welcome back to Happy in the Mess. Today is a very interesting topic. We are going to be talking about how to identify red flags before and after you tie the knot. Today with us, we have Sherry, the relationship coach, and Matthew Morgan, the misfit coach. And just as a reminder, everyone here, we're also therapists as well as coaches, but we are not your therapist or coach. But if you'd like to work with us, please reach out. You can see our links in the description box. So please remember to like, share, and subscribe and rate our podcast. We'd love to hear from you. And if you like these topics, let us know so we can produce more content like it. So I'd like to hear from both Sherry and Matthew. Where can people find you should they want to work with you? Sherry?
The best place to find me is I run the Date Night community on Facebook. It is a group dedicated to helping couples really have connected and close relationships. You also can find out all the information about me at sherrytimko.com.
Wonderful. And Matthew?
I am at matthewemorgan.com or the Misfit Refuge if you want to check out the socials. And I handle people who are neurodivergent, trying to fit in, people who struggle with spirituality issues, and just kind of a hodgepodge of misfitty stuff in between.
Excellent. I love it. Thank you both. And you can find me at coachmarlena.com, and I work with spiritual singles and all the issues that may befall them, such as loneliness, wanting to get into a relationship, and even how to help navigate what to do with their money. So anyway, today we're going to be talking about those red flags. Sometimes we ignore them, and sometimes they don't show up until later. And first, let's start in the chronology sort of our relationships when people are just dating. So what are some red flags that you will have seen as coaches and therapists that may show up prior to getting married? That may be a sign that you shouldn't get married.
Yeah, I'm really split on this. I think that if you see red flags when you're dating, you should absolutely break up and find I'm like, just move on. Like, let's move on. Like, don't spend too much time here. But then once people cross that divide and they make that long-term commitment, then I'm like, okay, how do we make this work? So my red flags, like, they're very minor when it comes to dating, but it takes it's a really big difference when they're married. And I'm like, is that really a red flag, or is this something we can work around?
Interesting. So you're more lenient, it sounds like, or become to be more fine workable things after the marriage vows have been said and the commitment has happened.
Yeah. So in a dating relationship, I'm like, well, are they making you happy? Like, are you bringing out the best in each other? Are you like, are there things that just really get on your nerves? Like, these are all things to consider that, you want to find the best fit person. You don't want to be making yourself fit with someone when you're dating.
That's really good advice. What about you, Matthew? What do you say?
I think for me, it is so cliche, but I'm going to go right back to communication. I think that can be one of the biggest red flags. And not that like dating, sure, there's awkward conversation moments, and we're trying to learn pacing and learn how each other communicates. And I'm all for understanding, like, we will step on landmines, we'll say something completely stupid off the wall and it'll offend the other person possibly. And I wouldn't necessarily consider that a red flag in itself, because we're learning the steps. But I think part of it is, how do we repair afterwards? If you brush it over and you say, hey, you shouldn't feel this way, I'm gonna, big red flag, because that's going to be something that carries over into all of this. So you can check and see, how does this person communicate? How do they repair in the process? Are we on the same wavelength? And much like Sherry said, like, if at the dating stage we're not there and we're not making progress and we're not fitting, that's probably a good idea to move to the next one, swipe the next way, and try to find the right, find somebody that can communicate in a more productive or proactive way.
I like that, swipe left. But hope springs eternal for so many people in the dating stage. They think that the love and the honeymoonish and the chemistry will carry them through these sticky points. But I'm hearing y'all say, and I think I agree. Like this stuff carries over into the marriage. If it's not being worked out and fixed in the dating, it sounds like it might get worse later, not better. Would you all say that's true?
Yeah, so when you first get together, there's this whole chemical cocktail that makes everything seem much, much better than it actually is. So that wears off at some point. And so if the rest of the relationship is not solid,
Mm,
then there's not going to be that feeling to carry it through. So
mm,
communication, but also do your values and goals match up? Do you want the same things out of life?
mhm,
Kids and where you're going to live are two non-negotiables that I have found with couples. Probably the third one would be the structure of the relationship. And if those three things, if you're out of alignment with any of those three things, then you really can't bridge if one person wants kids and the other does not. Like there is no negotiation or compromise on that. I worked with a couple once and she wanted to live in Florida and he hated Florida. And there really was no compromise on that issue. And we tried to find ways around that, but there just wasn't.
mm,
And then the third one is relationship structure. So there's a lot of relationship structure stuff that you can kind of work around. But if someone really wants an open relationship and the other one wants a traditional relationship, these things just like they just aren't you can't navigate them or find a compromise around them.
mhm. So core values got to be the same because that's going to end up in major conflict, potentially divorce down the line. And the biggies are kids, where you're going to live. Are we monogamous? Are we not?
Yeah. Matthew, do you have any other of those like make it or break it ones?
Um, all those plus, I would say finances are one
Yes.
of the biggest topics of who handles the finances, and a lot of us, we come to relationships with this expectation that we do it typically like our parents have or like our family of origin does. And not everybody has that same structure. One of the weirdest things that weird, and I'm going to use this in big quotes for those that are just listening. My wife does daycare out of the house, and one of the families, he pays 1 week out of his account, she pays 1 week out of her account. And my wife and I looked at each other like, oh, that's weird. Like from minute one, we were, everything has been combined and it's been open. But that's not bad. But it's obviously something they've agreed on and has worked for them. So I think finances, again, who handles it, how we do this, are we spenders, are we savers, how do we, again, that part I wouldn't necessarily put in a red flag, but that's a good yellow flag of how do we communicate through those things as well.
Basically,
Yeah.
how you approach money. Go ahead.
Well, so I usually have couples where one is a saver and one is a spender. And so those two fit really well together if you see each other as bringing something that is a strength to the relationship. Okay, so the money, just because you have different philosophies on it, doesn't seem like that seems normal to me that you
Mhm.
would have different philosophies and you're going to have to navigate how to make those fit together. What doesn't work is when people are at the extreme and one is like really a big saver and has very little flexibility on it, and the other one really wants to use money to live life to its fullest. And so the more extreme you get is where you get into problems. But being different on that is actually
Correct.
a wonderful balance for one another, because if one is focused on saving and the other one wants to use the money to live life well, then you find that middle ground and you do both.
Mhm.
Yeah. There, in this case, there is a difference between living in Florida and not Florida. There is a middle ground that we can have a consensus on if we've communicated our way to that point.
Yeah.
Well, I've also found many couples who don't actually talk about these things prior to marriage, and they've always had issues with how the other one was handling their money. So it goes back to what you were saying, communication on the front end you may avoid these pitfalls later, but of course this is not a one and done conversation around money because circumstances change over the course of life. So pregnancy, kids, someone loses a job, illness can disrupt the flow of money or what have you. And so, yeah, I think this is a big issue, and you can't cover all topics. So do you think though this is a trend in social media that I'm seeing a lot of, is this idea that the man should be able to provide financially regardless of the woman's salary? And I'm curious if you all have any thoughts on that. Even if she, contributes, that he should be a provider. There's this whole idea of being masculine and feminine and how people embody those and how a relationship works better. And, for same-sex couples, this is obviously going to look different, perhaps, or maybe the same. I don't know. Do you all have any thoughts on that, though?
Yeah, this is a structure issue. Okay.
Mm.
What you're talking about is a traditional relationship.
Mm.
And if both parties come to the relationship and they say, we want a pretty traditional relationship, then that is going to work better for them. Part of the allure of a traditional relationship is that the roles are pretty prescribed. So you
Mm.
don't have to do a lot of negotiation around what those roles should be. Now, there's lots of other relationship structures. And so if you're talking about a more egalitarian structure where both parties are pretty much have equal power and equal authority in the relationship, then suggesting to them that the male should have that winning role, like that's gonna be a non-starter, and that's gonna blow up in a relationship. So yeah, that does work for people who ascribe to that particular relationship structure.
Mm. Matthew, would you like to weigh in
I,
on this?
I got not, I mean, I will 100% agree. Like it's when you come to the table, what are we offering and what are we expecting? And can we negotiate through it? Can we not? Is it a complete deal breaker? Obviously there are certain roles that may be prescribed to a gender in a relationship that we can't take over. I think that's a nice way of saying I can't have a baby. But again, with that, I'm going back to communication, right? Can we talk about it? Can we say this is what I need? This is what I want in a relationship, and how do we negotiate that with each other to get that? Because
And
all of it's
part of that, the core part of that is knowing what you want and need. And if you don't know what you want and need and where you stand, then it's really hard to say, well, this is what I want and need from the relationship.
Mm. Yeah, and I also find then that having, dated some and different types of partners prior to tying the knot is really helpful to help sift out what it is you want and need. I think sometimes you just don't know until you've experienced a variety of things to know, oh, this works for me structurally in my and this doesn't. Because we don't come out the gate, I don't think, always knowing that ahead of time without some experimentation. And some people may disagree, but that's what I have found, that like usually our previous relationships give us blueprints of what we'd like in the next one. And are there things, so we've talked about these issues. It sounds like values really aren't, if there's not an agreement, those things aren't really fixable prior to getting married, or are they?
Here's the thing, and this is probably why I have this really weird split where I'm like, oh, throw that relationship away if that's not good. But then once you cross that divide, it's like, all right, now you're committed. Part of it is because people change over the course of time. So if you don't agree in the beginning, then it's really hard to imagine that you're going to agree more later. But if you start out an agreement, that's still not a guarantee that in 10 or 15 or 20 years, you're going to still be on the same page. Having kids is a great example of this. Lots of couples get together where they both know what they want and they're on the same page about that. Particularly in the case of not wanting kids, when you find a partner who does not want kids with you, like that's a real good matchup. But that doesn't mean that in 10 years, one of you won't have changed or grown or developed some need for kids, that then you have to renegotiate that and decide whether that relationship is still able to survive that change.
Mm.
Or vice versa. I mean, somebody that comes and their idea is that, hey, we want to have kids, and one or both have infertility issues. And now we have a renegotiation where, our biology and our values are not jiving with each other here a little bit. So,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Sometimes it's not just a change of heart, it's a circumstance that then, yeah, prevents someone from doing something. So what makes a marriage then sustainable? I know this is kind of leading off of this conversation, then what keeps it going, knowing that we change sometimes? And let's say everything was starting out well in dating, on the same page, et cetera, et cetera. What keeps a marriage going healthily along?
Being too darn stubborn to quit. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, determination is a point. I think going back to those values, can we hold tight to those, push to them, and say, this is what we're holding on to, and either it's a dance, right? Either we pivot together or we find a way that we can move and still get what we need.
Mhm.
Or is this a point at which we have to let go? Yeah.
And determination, stubbornness, some might also call that commitment.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
Probably a
commitment,
nicer word for it. Yeah.
so commitment is a piece of it. It's also navigating change. That change is inevitable, and so being flexible around that.
Mhm.
It's also having good expectations. I have never met a couple who has not been through some really awful things. I mean, I wish I could say that that's not a part of being in a relationship. And a lot of times it's easier when those awful things come from outside the relationship. But very often couples find themselves in situations where one of them has really hurt the other person. And sometimes that's little, and sometimes that feels catastrophic.
Mm.
So, understanding that you're going to have to weather a lot of things and there are going to be tough times. Now, they shouldn't all be tough times, but that you're going to have to figure it out as you go along with things that you can't predict.
Mm. Yeah, I had an acquaintance who was been married some very, very long time, maybe over 50 years, and she was celebrating her wedding anniversary, and I got to see her that day, and she said, how did we make it? And she said, no one left and we kept talking. I was like, wow, that's very simple, but no one's leaving and we keep talking. I was like, that sounds like a good recipe, good ingredients to keep the marriage going. But this really segues into my next thing, is that how do you know when the red flags, when it's time to leave the marriage? I know, Sherry, that you often say, and I really admire this, that a lot of things are workable, that you're kind of in the relationship corner. Like if you made the commitment, find, it's probably easier to stay and work through it than divorce and move on. That's not always the case though. But how do you then determine, like, this marriage really isn't workable for me and it's time to go? And I think you gave a hint, like if it's more misery than it is joy. But even that, is that workable? Like, is that really the relationship's responsibility, or does that go back to individual happiness and we're all adults here and responsible for our own? And curious thoughts.
Yeah, you've been listening to me for a while, haven't you? Um, yeah, this is such an individual decision. I think everyone knows where that point is where they can't keep going. And so there's not a hard and fast rule. I would say abuse, whether that's physical or emotional abuse, or being in a relationship that is so controlling that you can't be your own person at all, those are really hard to even justify working on. But I have worked with couples that worked through those sorts of situations as well. So I don't feel like I can be the one who says, here's where that line is. The other thing that really is very, very hard to navigate is when one partner is a substance abuser. alcoholic substance abuser. Now, again, I've seen great examples of couples who've worked through that, but it's so hard. It's hard on the individuals, and it's hard on the relationship, and it's hard on everybody around them as they
Mhm.
navigate that. So in terms of hard and fast rules, I don't know that I have them. And I think there's there's two things that I try to answer when I work with couples who are trying to answer that question, should we stay together? One is, what would it take to get you from where you are today to the relationship that you really want? And that's not just getting along, that's a really good, healthy relationship. And that there is a roadmap between those two things. But the other question I ask myself is, how much energy is that going to take? Because there is an element of being exhausted. And sometimes having the roadmap and being able to see that you can get to that really good relationship is still not going to work if you have been working on this for a really long time and you're just exhausted and you don't have the energy to try and fix things.
Mm. Yeah.
I think there's a point at which the damage is too great. And unfortunately, I mean, I always like, and Sherry, to your point, right? I mean, there are times couples come back from pretty devastating things. But at some point the it's not there. So a lot of times paying attention to that and where the patterns have been, do we have enough to kind of keep going forward with it? And I think the other, I was just, I listen to you, Sherry, was this idea of, can we get to what we want in a relationship? Do we know what we want? Have we said what we want out of the relationship? And everybody does it. ND community, the neurodiverse, I think we do this a lot because we've always feel so awkward and feel like we don't fit in. Anyway, we're trying to figure out all this weird stuff, why we, can't listen to somebody chew or, but like, can we get to that point of really knowing what we want in a relationship and put that out there and ask it, and take that risk and be vulnerable and say, if we're going to do this, and not in a power struggle sense, but in a sense of just open and honest of, this is what I really need out of this relationship. And if we haven't even got to that point yet, then I mean, that's something we need to do. We need to put that on the table before we walk away from it.
And I would say, Matthew, too, that's the case for even those of us who aren't neurodivergent. Like, those conversations need to be had, like putting up front, even if that might mean the demise or the end of the relationship, because it is so much easier to unwind or unravel a dating relationship than a marriage. And so having those hope is so stubborn. Like, I think there's a lot of people who just carry on and get married hoping that this thing will change. And that is rarely the case. Like, marriage does not usually change someone, but I am curious what your thoughts are on how living together prior to marriage may change, or if anything changes once you do get married. I think some people think, oh, we're living together and this is a good trial run, and if we can tolerate this, marriage is great. But sometimes, I don't know, does that help or hurt living together prior to your marriage?
Yes and no, which is probably my answer to everything. Yes
It
and no.
depends.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people do live together kind of as a trial, and that it can really reveal a lot about who you are and who the other person is. And it's really hard to keep up that best behavior front that people do when they're dating. So that can really be helpful. A couple of the pitfalls are, one is that the research says that couples who live together are before they get married, are more likely to break up. So, it's hard to argue those facts. That doesn't mean that your relationship will face that, but there is something that feels more disposable or flexible when you live together before you get married. But the other pitfall is that people expect nothing to change after they got married. And there's some weird mental shifts that happen that if you're not looking for them, you're going to miss them, and they can really set you up to get into some trouble. Sometimes after people get married, they really relax in a way that they didn't before. And so you see some things that maybe you didn't see before. And then there's a shift that happens where you're like, oh, I'm stuck with this person for the next 50 years. That chewing that annoyed me before seemed like, okay, if I'm just dealing with this today, it's fine. But when I think of myself every single day for the next 50 years listening to this chewing, then, I feel like I'm going to lose my mind. So even though that is the same chewing experience, before you get married and after, the mental interpretation of it becomes different. All right, so there's one more. I'll just throw this in. There's this other weird thing where before you get married, you're a partner and a lover and someone you date. And after you get married, you fall into the category of family. And so if your family has some really dysfunctional rules around it, you start to put that partner in those same rules where you didn't before you were married. So, but these are all mental things. They aren't necessarily logistical or the functionality of how you're living together.
Mm. So just to clarify, I heard that statistic too, Sherry, about couples will more likely break up if they were to live together prior to marriage, but I hear that it's more likely to divorce. I just wanted clarity. Is it break up while they're still dating, or is it divorce once they've gotten married?
It's divorce once they're married. And I can't really explain the whys of that. I just know that there's the numbers behind that.
Well, my theory is related to, I have a theory around this, and I think it's related to what you just talked about, those mental shifts, like that there might be a mental shift happening where people expect a change to happen in the relationship, even though they've been living together, that, oh, once we're married, this will be different. And then it's not. And then I wonder if people are somehow disappointed in that, perhaps. It's just a theory.
I don't know if that's true. I've worked with a lot of couples who were in that transition, and every single one of them have told me, oh yeah, nothing's going to change. We've been living together. This is going to be the same as it was before. We're just doing this for the formal commitment, or we're just doing this for fill in the blank. So I don't know, but these mental shifts, these weird mental shifts, these fascinate me, and we don't give them enough credit, and they're really out of our purview, and they're out of our control to some degree, and we can navigate them if we recognize them, but a lot of times we just let them unfold the way they do.
They're blind spots. So maybe it's not that they wish things would change and then they don't, but maybe they do and they weren't expecting it. Yeah, it could go that way. Matthew, do you have thoughts on this?
The thing that jumps to mind here is that, when people start talking about dating and my wife and I have been together for 26 years. So I'm always like, my initial response is, I haven't gone on a date in all this time. And then I realize, like, I have to watch that mental shift, because that's baloney. I do go out. I just go out with, the same person, and I know what she likes, and she knows what I like, and she deals with my food intolerances. And like, so there's a beauty in that, but we have to shift it to that point of like, oh, we're still actively doing this, not passively, and if there was only some sort of like date night community where somebody was out there encouraging us to do this and work for oh, wait, Sherry's community, shameless promotion there,
Oh, thank you, Matthew.
like, but no, I mean, in all honesty, like, it is a mental shift of this, of, whether we're living together, married together, like, is our energy focused on building this relationship, or are we focused on maintaining our own comfort, our own lane, whatever that may be? So I think that's probably one of the things I see in this idea of living together. Anecdotally, I mean, my wife and I, one of the things I chalk our time up to is we moved to North Dakota. We moved, 1,200 miles from our house a year after we got married. There was no like run away from this thing. So, the washer breaks, like, we're gonna have to fix it. We're mad at each other. We don't get to go to, so and so's house. We're in the middle of nowhere, and it's like we have to work at it. So again, mental, regardless of what it is, and I know what the statistics say, but I'd be curious as to what our mental state is. Are we working on the relationship? really is the big thing.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Working on the relationship, I also think that growing together is important. That like you're supposed to grow. You're supposed to get wiser. You're supposed to have experiences. And those experiences don't have to be with your partner, but there needs to be some looping in so that your partner is aware of changes as they're happening. And that's a really good way to grow together so that even if you're not having the same growth experiences, you are vicariously witnessing and journeying with them so that you can have different experiences and different growth, but you stay connected. And what many couples do is they will have this period of growth and their partner really won't be part of it. And then they're like, hey, where are you? Why aren't you with me? And then they start to feel like they've grown apart. Now, if you're committed to the relationship, then what happens is you kind of have this coming back together at these different points. And if you're less committed or you feel like you've diverged too much, then you feel like you've grown apart and you leave the relationship.
Mm. Yeah, so that brings me to my next question is what are the solutions then if you find yourselves growing apart, if there's a rough patch or even these red flags, like when your marriage is in trouble, what do you do?
Lots and lots of options.
Yeah, lots
Mhm.
of options. There's no hard and fast on this either. But, for our listeners, what would you all kind of recommend?
I think one of the biggest things is take a pause and really, this is what you're, I think if I'm catching right, what we're hearing is that the check engine light has come on in the relationship. The goal is not to get that, power down the freeway with oil pouring out of it kind of thing. I think there's a lot of damage that can be done there. So if we can stop and pause and assess and work with somebody who's, if we need to work with somebody who's trained in a relationship, finding a book. I mean, there's so many good resources out there for couples that really want to invest. There's a lot of bad relationship or bad, stuff out there for couples too, or stuff that doesn't fit that couple dynamic, which
Mm,
I think is where this goes back to that organic feel of working with a coach or a counselor who can help you navigate and see where some of these problems are, and then you can renegotiate that as a couple. Can we meet this, or has this, has the yellow flag suddenly turned red? Yeah.
mhm,
So you can be proactive or you can plan on doing cleanup. And you'll probably need some element of both, but being proactive is having examples of relationships that function well, even having a mentor couple that you kind of think of when you're trying to navigate some things that are really tough. I met a lot of couples who really don't have examples of good marriages around them, and then they struggle to figure out what a good marriage looks like. I love the suggestion of reading a book. There are some really good books out there. I highly recommend The Seven Principles for Making Marriage Work by Gottman, my very, very favorite book. But I even recommend reading a bad marriage book. Some of the best conversations that I've had with my husband were because we were reading a book and I was like, this does not apply at all. Here's why this doesn't work for us. And so even hearing bad marriage advice that you then process and say, yeah, that doesn't work. I had a book that I was reading and I was ready to burn. It was so horrible. I was so mad. But
mm,
there's good that can come out of that in terms of your relationship.
mm,
Um, and then once you realize that there is something that's not working well, then looking to intentional advice, taking a course, um, going to a coach, going to a therapist. Therapists tend to be more for if there is a real crisis, an acute crisis, but therapy is also good for relationship enhancement sort of things. Coaching tends to be less crisis oriented, but more about like, let's break some patterns, let's let's set up a good foundation and that sort of stuff.
mhm.
Um, Oh, so many thoughts, so many thoughts. All right, let me stop there because I lost my train of thought, and there's so many different ways of
Well,
working in a relationship.
I like how you brought up like you can be proactive or you can plan on cleanup. And I wonder if you would advise couples who have not yet gotten married but are seriously dating to enter into a coaching or counseling relationship to keep their relationship on track, or just work through certain things that might be coming up. Because I think a lot of couples think, oh, if we're going to counseling even before we're married, this is a red flag. And I'm kind of like to
So
hear what.
if you go to coaching or to therapy when the problems are small, you can usually spend like 3 to 5 sessions, learn some skills, apply them, and shift the whole trajectory of your relationship. When you wait until there's been a crisis, then you may be needing 15 to a year's worth of therapy in order to get things back on the right track. And then you have to do the cleanup. It isn't just about changing the patterns, it's also about doing the repairs.
Mm,
Yeah. Okay. So let me share this with everyone just because I have I've really been working on how to help couples avoid crisis. I would love for everyone that I talk to say, you know what, I don't want to live through an affair before we make some changes in the relationship. I don't want to find out that my spouse spent $100,000 that I didn't know of before we decide to fix these problems. Okay. But what I have found is that when I get to the end of therapy, I often ask couples what I could have said to them or what someone could have said to them 6 months or a year before that crisis that would have gotten them to work on that issue before then. Do you know what they tell me unilaterally? Nothing.
mm,
They say, there is nothing that you could have told me a year ago that would have made me deal with this problem then. So there is a certain element of being in a marriage where you pick the right person and then you want that relationship to kind of run on autopilot in the back of your life while you live the rest of your life, where you raise your kids and you have a career and you move to different places, and so lots of people, like, we really need to be prepared for the fact that you're probably going to neglect your relationship, and then there's going to be a crisis, and then you're going to do cleanup, and then you're going to get on the right track and have really good intentions, and then you're going to neglect your relationship. And then so respond to the small crises. Like, don't wait for there to be a big crisis.
mhm.
So wait, you're saying Disney is not correct in their whole happily ever after assumption when two people get together?
Right.
Yeah, that's not right. And you can't wait for your vacation to connect. Oh, we're
Mm,
so busy. We don't have time. We can't go on a date. We don't have time to sit down and talk with each other. We'll go on a big trip. We'll reconnect, and then that will carry us through the next year or 5 years. How many people go on vacation
Mm.
every year? So there's some expectations that don't really fit the reality of what it takes to have a good relationship.
mm,
Yeah, 100.
yeah. So I was gonna say the things that do not work, I think are worth mentioning. Oftentimes when couples are having issues, they think a trip is one I hadn't like maybe a trip is gonna fix this, or a baby, or opening up the marriage. Let's talk. I mean, I know we're running out of time, but curious, why don't these things work?
The trip is a great example. I love that one because it's, you know, we our culture, it's a busy culture, and one, both, both people are working, especially when you start factoring kids into this, but even if not, I mean, there's this constant grind, and then there's all sorts of other things that grab our attention. There's social media that we can spend, doom scrolling, and there's good things, but at the same time, we're neglecting our relationship for these things. And I would much rather see a couple take the phones and put the phones down for 10 minutes a night than to go off to Barbados for the weekend, every 5 years or whatever it is. I think it's a principle of nature is that a system needs constant maintenance. I can't go out and water my garden once a week and say, be okay with this. Although with the weather we've been having lately, it's okay. Like, like it just needs that constant attention. I think that's why those little things don't work for that in particular.
Mm.
Mm. This whole idea that we're going to make a big shift and change the dynamic, I mean, there's some logic to it. Like, this isn't working, let's do something different. So we're going to open our relationship, we're going to have a baby, we're going to move to a different place, we're going to get a different job. Those changing the dynamics can be really helpful, but if you don't do the day-to-day maintenance, then those big shifts are more likely to backfire than to actually build the relationship. So if you want a really good relationship, set aside 5 or 10 minutes every day to connect with your partner. Don't wait for these really big epic moments where you can go on a date where you have 2 or 3 hours to do something fun, or you can set aside a week to like really connect with each other. Like, that stuff that you do on the day-to-day basis makes a much bigger impact on your relationship than those big things.
And in fact,
20
those big things might, result in a total disruption and severing and divorce.
Mhm. Yep. Say
Yeah.
20 seconds of meaningful touch, is like non-sexual touch. Like, just get in there and and give a hug as they're making dinner, or hold a hand, or things like that. And yeah, that goes a lot further and a lot less likely to backfire than to be in another country and
Mhm.
have all the money and the time outgo for that.
Mhm.
And argue the whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this has been go ahead, Matthew.
I would say, and we talked about, I knew you threw in there that idea of like, well, let's put somebody else in here to fix, a particular need of a couple, whether it's an emotional need or a physical need. And if we're not able to do that with two, once you start factoring in 3 or 4, again, that part, unless you've been really mindful and have talked about it, it doesn't fix. It's an addition. And I think people expect that to be the quick fix. And oftentimes, again, it will backfire most of the time,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Amplify.
and I just want to throw in that we are not saying don't have kids,
Oh,
and we're not saying don't open your relationship. It's just that doing those things won't fix a bad relationship.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
100%. Yep.
Yes. I'm glad y'all mentioned that. I feel like that is kind of the desperate attempts for people to repair things without realizing that those small bids for attention and reception and whatnot and communication needs to be present well before deciding to make major changes to the relationship itself by adding in third parties like children or people or other adults. So this has been a very enlightening episode. I'm really glad we got to talk about these marriage and even dating red flags to help people navigate. And there's no one size fits all. And I just want to remind everyone of that. And just as a reminder, if people would like to work with you, where can they find you? Matthew, let's start with you.
I am at MatthewEMorgan.com or Misfit Refuge on socials.
Awesome. Sherry?
Thank you for letting me geek out on this. I'm very passionate about this topic. You can find me at sherrytimcare.com or in the date night community in a Facebook group. And I really focus on helping couples have that deeply connected and satisfying relationship.
Excellent. And you can find me at coachmarlena.com, and I work with singles, helping them figure out their values and their red flags and their non-negotiables, prior to getting into a relationship or tying the knot. So look for us if you'd like to work with us. In the description box, you can find our links. And also, just as a reminder, like, share, and subscribe, rate, review. It really helps with us with the algorithm. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you. See you next time.